Get out now double, she broke the rules cross mark. And most importantly, you never broke them. Doing so would bring down the wrath of the town's leaders, the elders, who were known for their strict control over everyone's lives. They held the power, and they made sure everyone remembered that. Life in the town was predictable. People went about their business, working hard, following the rules, and living in a quiet harmony. They didn't ask questions about why things were the way they were, they just accepted them. There was no room for rebellion, no space for anyone to step out of line. But Leela had always been different. She wasn't rebellious in the loud, obvious way. No, Leela was quiet, observant. She followed the rules mostly, but she questioned them in her mind. She wondered why certain things were done a particular way. She wondered what would happen if someone didn't do exactly what was expected of them. She never said these things aloud, of course. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, but deep down, she felt like something was missing. The life she was living, following all the rules and expectations, wasn't all there was to the world. It wasn't that she wanted chaos. She didn't want to bring down the entire system. But she had dreams, big ones, and she had a feeling that the world outside their town was different, freer. Leela's curiosity was her quiet rebellion. She watched the people around her, wondering if they too secretly wished for more, but she kept it to herself. She didn't want to be caught in the act of questioning. The rules, however, were beginning to feel heavier with each passing day. It was a subtle change, a creeping feeling that she couldn't ignore. For a long time, she thought maybe it was just her, that maybe everyone else was perfectly content with the way things were. But then, she noticed something. It was in the way people whispered about the council meetings. The elders were always watching, always listening. No one ever spoke out of turn. And if someone did, if someone dared to defy the rules, even in the smallest way, they were quickly silenced. The punishment was always the same. A warning, a shaming, a reminder that no one was above the rules. The consequences were always clear, and the fear of those consequences was enough to keep most people in line. But Leela wasn't afraid of punishment, at least not anymore. She was more afraid of living a life that was too predictable, too safe. One evening, as Leela walked through the town square, she overheard a conversation between two women. They were talking about a new rule that had just been imposed. No one was allowed to leave the town without permission. At first, it seemed harmless. After all, why would anyone want to leave? The town had everything they needed: work, food, safety. But the more Leela thought about it, the more she felt uneasy. Why did they need to control where people went? Why couldn't anyone leave if they wanted to? She tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe she was overthinking it. After all, this was how life had always been. But the more she thought about it, the more restless she became. The rules felt stifling. They made her feel trapped. It wasn't long before Leela met Max, a quiet man who worked at the town's bakery. Max was a bit of an outsider, never really fitting in with the rest of the people. He was kind-hearted, but he always seemed to be thinking about something else. There was an air of mystery about him, and people often whispered that he had once been part of the council but had left under strange circumstances. One day, as Leela was walking past the bakery, Max stopped her. "Hey, you seem troubled," he said, his voice low but kind. Leela was taken aback. She wasn't used to people noticing her, let alone talking to her in such a personal way. But there was something about Max that made her feel like she could trust him. I don't know," she said, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "I feel like something isn't right here. It's like we're all living in a bubble following these rules without ever questioning why. I don't know, I just feel trapped." Max nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I understand. I've felt the same way for a long time. It's easy to get comfortable with the way things are, but deep down, you start to wonder, what if there's more out there? What if we're not meant to live like this forever?" Leela looked at him in surprise. She had never said these thoughts aloud to anyone before. Yet here was Max, someone who understood. "Do you think the rules are wrong?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Max didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the town square as if seeing it for the first time. "I don't know if they're wrong, but I do know they're keeping us from something. We're all just going through the motions, but deep down we know there's more to life than this." Leela felt her heart race. What if Max was right? What if there was something else? Something beyond the rules that had governed their lives for so long. From that moment on, Leela couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change. She began to observe more closely, listening to the whispers of those around her. The more she listened, the more she realized that she wasn't the only one questioning things. There were others, too, who felt the same way but were too afraid to speak up. The rules they followed were not as unbreakable as they had always seemed. Leela knew she couldn't be the one to break them, not yet anyway. But the seed of doubt had been planted and it was growing. Soon she would have to decide: continue to live the life she had always known, or take a step into the unknown, where the rules no longer had power over her. Leela couldn't shake the thoughts that had been racing through her mind since her conversation with Max. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how trapped she felt. The rules, the restrictions, the unspoken boundaries, they had always been there and she had always accepted them. But now they seemed suffocating. It was as if the walls around her were closing in, and the air was growing thinner with every passing day. She had always been careful, always tried to blend in. She followed the rules because she didn't want to draw attention to herself. She didn't want to be the one to cause a stir. But something had changed. She could no longer ignore the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. The rules weren't just laws, they were chains, keeping her from living the life she dreamed of. Max's words echoed in her mind. What if there's more out there? What if we're not meant to live like this forever? It was a simple thought, but it made her heart beat faster. What if he was right? What if the life she had been living, this life of quiet obedience and safety, wasn't all there was? The thought made her feel both terrified and excited at the same time. But there was no turning back now. She had begun to notice the small things, the cracks in the system that everyone else seemed to overlook. People in the town were becoming more anxious, more wary of each other. Whispers filled the air, not just about the new rules but about the growing number of people who were starting to question them. There were rumors of a small group of people who had begun meeting in secret, talking about change, about freedom. It was a dangerous thing to even mention, and yet Leela couldn't ignore it. Her mind kept returning to the new rule, the one that had forbidden anyone from leaving the town without permission. It was something so simple, so seemingly innocent, yet it felt like a prison. What was the purpose of keeping everyone here? What were they hiding? She tried to brush off the feeling, but it clung to her like a shadow, following her everywhere she went. It was during one of these restless nights that Leela's thoughts became clearer. She had to make a choice. She could keep quiet, keep following the rules, and live a safe, predictable life. Or she could do something about it, take a step toward the unknown, where there were no guarantees, but where she might find something real. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. People didn't just defy the rules, they were punished for it. The elders, the ones who ran the town, were not kind to those who dared to break their laws. But Leela had already seen the signs, the unease, the whispers, the people who were starting to ask questions. There was something growing, something that couldn't be ignored, and if she didn't take action now, she might never get the chance again. The next morning, she decided to visit Max again. There was something about him that made her feel less alone in all this. He had seen the cracks in the system long before she had, and somehow, that gave her the courage to confront the fear that had been holding her back. Max was in the bakery when she arrived. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, comforting and warm, but Leela felt nothing but anxiety. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "You're here," he said softly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "What's on your mind?" Leela took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. I can't stop thinking about it, about what we talked about last time, the rules, the control. I feel like I'm suffocating, Max. I don't know what to do. Max's expression softened. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he looked at her thoughtfully. I know how you feel. Believe me, I've been where you are. But you have to understand, doing something about it means taking a risk. There's no going back once you start. Leela swallowed hard. I know, but I can't keep living like this. I need to know if there's something more, something beyond all these rules and restrictions. I don't even know what I'm looking for, but I have to find it. Max studied her for a moment as if weighing her words. Finally, he spoke. You're not alone in this, Leela. There are others who feel the same way. People who are starting to question everything, the rules, the authority, the control. There's a group of us who have been meeting in secret. We talk about what could happen if we finally break free from all this, but it's dangerous. If the council finds out, if anyone finds out, Leela felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. You're saying there are others, Max nodded slowly. Yes, but you have to be careful. The more you talk about it, the more you risk drawing attention to yourself. The council doesn't tolerate this kind of talk. They'll stop at nothing to keep things the way they are. Leela's heart raced. She had always played it safe, always kept her thoughts to herself. But now the idea of something bigger, something outside the town, seemed irresistible. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something important, something that could change everything. Where do I fit in? Leela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What do I do next? Max looked at her with a mixture of understanding and caution. For now, just be patient. Watch, listen, find the others. They're not hard to spot once you know what to look for. But don't rush into anything. You don't know who you can trust yet. Leela nodded, a spark of determination lighting in her chest. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finally on the right path. The walls around her, the rules, the control, none of it mattered anymore. She had a new goal, a new purpose, and nothing would stop her from finding out what lay beyond the world she had always known. As she left the bakery, the weight of what she had decided settled over her like a cloak. She was stepping into the unknown, into a world where everything could change. And no matter the risks, she couldn't turn back now. The days that followed felt like they were moving in slow motion. Leela's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and plans, but each time she tried to act on them, doubt crept in. The fear of what could happen if she was caught, if the council found out what she was planning, was enough to make her hesitate. But at the same time, something inside her told her she couldn't wait any longer. The urge to break free, to see what else the world had to offer, was too strong to ignore. She spent the next few days watching, listening. She started paying more attention to the people around her, trying to figure out who might be part of the group Max had mentioned. At first, it wasn't easy. The people she spoke to seemed normal, just like anyone else in the town, quiet, obedient, following the rules without question. But Leela knew there had to be someone who felt the same way she did. She just had to find them. It wasn't until a few days later that she noticed a familiar face, Jonah, the town's blacksmith. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man who was known for his quiet demeanor. Jonah had always been one of those people who seemed to stay out of the spotlight. He kept to himself, worked hard, and never caused any trouble. But there was something about the way he looked at her one evening as she passed by the forge that made Leela's heart skip a beat. It was the same look she had seen in her own reflection, a look of longing, of someone who knew there was more to life than what they were living. Leela stopped in her tracks. Jonah didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his dark eyes full of something she couldn't quite place. But then, slowly, he stepped forward. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" he said in a low voice, barely loud enough to hear over the hammering sounds of his forge. "You're thinking about what's beyond all this, the rules, the limits. You want more, don't you?" Leela froze, her heart racing. "How did you?" Jonah smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a knowing smile, the kind that comes from someone who had already walked the same path. I've seen it in your eyes. You're not the only one, Leela. There are others, people like you, like me. We've been watching, waiting. We know something has to change. Leela felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't just her. There were others who felt the same. But at the same time, she felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. What did this mean? How far were they willing to go? I've been talking to Max, Leela said quietly. He told me there's a group that wants to change things, but what if we're caught? What if they find out? Jonah's expression grew serious. If they find out, it'll be too late. But if we don't act, we'll never have a chance. The council has had control for too long. They've kept everyone in the dark, fed them lies, made them afraid to question anything. But we're not afraid anymore, Leela. You can't be afraid either. The weight of his words sank into her like a stone. She had spent her whole life being afraid of the consequences, afraid of the unknown. But now, she was starting to see that the real danger wasn't in stepping outside the rules. It was in staying silent, in doing nothing. I want to help, Leela said, her voice more determined than she had ever heard it. I want to do something, but how do we start? Jonah nodded, as if he had been waiting for her to say those words. We start small. We meet in secret like we've been doing. We talk, we plan. But we don't move too fast. If we rush, we'll make mistakes. We need to be careful. Leela agreed. She knew this wasn't something they could just rush into. The council wouldn't hesitate to punish anyone who stepped out of line. But if they were careful, if they planned every move, maybe they could make a difference. As the days passed, Leela began to meet with Jonah and a few others who were part of the secret group. They met in quiet, hidden places, behind the bakery, in the woods just outside the town, in abandoned houses. Each meeting was a little more dangerous than the last, but each time they came together, Leela felt more alive, more certain that this was the right thing to do. The group was small, but there was power in their unity. Eli, a former town guard, had joined their cause. He was tall and strong, with a quiet intensity that made him both intimidating and reassuring. Then there was Maya, a healer who had always kept to herself. She was calm and thoughtful, and her sharp mind had quickly proved invaluable. And finally, there was Darren, a young man who had grown up with Leela. He was passionate, eager for change, but also a bit reckless at times. Leela knew he could be dangerous if they weren't careful. Together, they formed a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. They would begin by gathering information, talking to people who were also questioning the system. They would find out who had the power, who was behind the council's rules, and what it would take to bring about change. The more they learned, the better prepared they would be for what came next. But the more they talked, the more Leela realized how much was at stake. This wasn't just about breaking a rule or two. This was about changing the very fabric of their society. If they failed, the consequences would be severe. If the council found out what they were planning, they would stop at nothing to maintain control. The weight of this knowledge settled heavily on Leela's shoulders, but it didn't deter her. If anything, it only strengthened her resolve. She had already made up her mind. She was going to fight for something better, for a life beyond the walls of fear and control that had held her for so long. And she wasn't going to do it alone. She had found allies, people who were ready to risk everything for the chance at a different life. Together they would face whatever came next. The days were becoming harder to track. Time had started to blur together, the weight of the plan pressing heavily on Leela's shoulders. The more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. She was taking risks she had never imagined possible, meeting in secret, speaking out against the council, going against everything she had been taught. But each time she met with the others, the spark of hope burned brighter inside her. The group had been meeting regularly now, getting stronger with every conversation, every shared secret. They weren't just talking anymore. They were planning, preparing. Leela knew they couldn't afford to make mistakes. One wrong move and everything could fall apart. The council had eyes everywhere, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who dared to challenge them. Jonah was the leader of their small group. His calm demeanor gave everyone else strength. He had been in the town for years, long enough to understand how the council operated. He had seen the corruption, the fear they instilled in people. His quiet strength made him the perfect person to lead them through this dangerous time. "You're doing well," Jonah said one evening after their latest meeting. His voice was low but steady, and Leela could hear the pride in his words. "Everyone's staying quiet, moving carefully. That's how we survive." Leela nodded, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. She knew they were being careful, but there was always the chance that one of them might slip up. A word said in the wrong place, a glance caught by the wrong person, it could all be over in an instant. Max, who had been a part of their group from the start, was usually the one to offer words of reassurance. He had seen the world beyond the town, knew what it was like to live without constant fear. It was his stories that had sparked Leela's curiosity in the first place. "I just don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," Leela admitted one evening as they sat together, the soft glow of the fire casting shadows around them. "The more we talk about it, the more it feels like it's all going to come crashing down. I can feel the walls closing in." Max looked at her with a steady gaze. "You're right to be cautious, Leela, but sometimes when you're fighting for something important, you have to accept the risk. If we don't do something, nothing will ever change. This town has been stuck for too long. We can't keep living in the shadows forever." Leela didn't respond right away. She understood what he was saying, but the fear was still there. She had lived her entire life under the rule of the council's laws. It wasn't easy to simply ignore the years of conditioning that had taught her to stay silent, to follow the rules without question. As the days passed, the group's actions became bolder. They started gathering information, talking to people who were willing to listen, and slowly, quietly, they built a network. Leela found herself spending more and more time with them, learning what she could about the council's inner workings, and starting to think about what they might do once they had enough support. But it wasn't enough to just have the support of a few people. They needed more. They needed the town to rise up, to wake from the slumber they had been in for so long. And that was the part that terrified Leela. Would they be able to inspire enough people to make a real difference? Or would the fear of the council's punishment keep everyone silent? One night, as the group was gathered in their usual secret spot, Jonah brought up a plan. "We've got the information we need," he said quietly, his voice full of authority. "It's time to act." Leela's heart skipped a beat. "Act? What do you mean?" "We can't just sit here anymore," Jonah continued, his eyes burning with determination. "The council's control over us is too strong. We can't just wait for things to change. We need to make a stand. It's time to show the people that they have the power to take back control." Leela's stomach tightened. "How do we do that? How do we make the people listen?" Jonah looked at her with a mixture of understanding and determination. "We're not going to make everyone listen at once, but we'll start small. We'll make sure the people who are ready to fight know that they're not alone. We'll give them the courage to stand with us. And once we have enough support, we'll make our move." Leela wasn't sure she was ready for what he was suggesting. She had been questioning the rules, thinking about breaking them, but now the reality of what they were about to do was hitting her hard. Max leaned forward, his expression serious. "It won't be easy. The council will strike back. But if we wait any longer, nothing will ever change. We'll be stuck in this life forever." Leela took a deep breath. She had always been cautious, always kept to herself. But now, standing on the edge of something bigger than herself, she realized that she had a choice. She could step back and let the council continue to control their lives, or she could take a risk and fight for the freedom she had always dreamed of. She looked around at the group. There was a fire in their eyes, a shared determination that made her feel like she wasn't alone in this anymore. It was no longer just about her. This was about all of them. "I'm in," Leela said, her voice stronger than she had ever heard it. "I'll do whatever it takes. Let's make this happen." Jonah gave a small nod, his face breaking into a rare, satisfied smile. "That's the spirit. We're going to do this, Leela, together." As the group began to make their plans, Leela felt a surge of hope and fear mixing inside her. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers she couldn't even fully comprehend. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finally doing something that mattered. She wasn't just living in fear anymore. She was fighting for a life where the rules didn't control her every move. And no matter what happened, she knew she would never go back to the way things were before. The night before everything was supposed to change, Leela couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. Tomorrow was the day when they would take their first real step toward breaking free from the council's grip. She had spent so many years following the rules, living in the shadows of fear, but now she was about to cross a line that couldn't be undone. What if it all went wrong? What if the council found out? The consequences for failure would be severe. She knew that better than anyone. People had disappeared before, silenced without a trace for speaking out, for questioning the power that controlled their lives. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no going back. The fear, the uncertainty, it had to be faced. They couldn't keep living under the shadow of the council forever. If they didn't act now, everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed of, would stay out of reach. Leela sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clenched in her lap. She could hear the sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the walls of her small room, but it felt far away, as though the world outside had become distant, irrelevant. All that mattered now was tomorrow. Tomorrow they would meet at the old mill on the edge of town, away from the prying eyes of the council, in a place where they could speak freely. It wasn't going to be a large gathering. The group was still small, but that was part of the plan. They couldn't risk drawing too much attention to themselves. They would talk to those who were ready to listen, who were willing to fight alongside them. It was all about starting a spark, something small that could grow into something bigger. Leela had been nervous about what might happen, about how people would react. She had never been one to lead, to step into the spotlight. But this wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about breaking free from the fear that had kept them all silent for so long. At dawn, Leela met with Jonah, Max, and the others in the place they had chosen. The morning air was cool, and the first light of the day shone dimly through the trees. It felt like a beginning. Jonah looked at each of them, his eyes steady, calm. "This is it. We've talked about this moment for weeks, and now it's time to make it happen. We can't waste any more time. The people we need to reach are here. We know who they are, and they know who we are. It's time to speak up, to show them that they don't have to be afraid anymore." Leela's hands were trembling, but she didn't let it show. She was scared, yes, but she wasn't alone. She had the support of these people, and that made all the difference. They weren't just friends or allies, they were a team. A team that was willing to risk everything for something bigger than themselves. The group gathered together, their faces filled with a mix of determination and fear. There was Eli, the former town guard who had once worked for the council. He was strong both in body and spirit, but Leela knew that even he was nervous about what they were about to do. Maya, the healer, stood next to him, her arms crossed. She had always been the calm one, but Leela could see the fire in her eyes now, a fire that matched the others. Darren, the youngest of them, looked both excited and nervous. He was the one who had been most eager to act, the one who had wanted to move faster than the rest. His passion was contagious, but sometimes Leela feared that his enthusiasm might lead them into danger. "All right," Jonah said, breaking the silence. "We know the risks, but we also know what's at stake. This is our moment to make a stand. We'll start by speaking to those we trust. The rest will follow. Let's not waste any more time." Leela nodded. She had heard Jonah speak many times, But this time, his words felt different. There was something about them that made her feel like they were on the verge of something that would change everything. The fear that had been so heavy on her chest was still there, but it no longer felt as suffocating. She wasn't alone. She wasn't the only one carrying this weight. They moved out, walking through the quiet streets of the town. The sun was rising higher now, casting a golden glow over the buildings, making everything feel surreal, as if they were walking through a dream. The sound of their footsteps seemed louder than usual, echoing off the walls as they made their way toward the meeting place. When they reached the old mill, the others were already there. A few had gathered in the shadow of the building, waiting for the signal. Leela could see the uncertainty in their faces, but there was also something else: hope. Hope that they were finally going to take back control of their lives. Jonah stood at the front, his voice steady and clear as he spoke to the crowd. "We've been living under the council's rule for far too long. We've been told what to do, how to think, and what to say. But we don't have to live like this anymore. It's time for a change. It's time for all of us to rise up to take back the power that was taken from us. You are not alone in this. We are stronger together." Leela stood at the back of the group, watching as Jonah spoke. She felt the weight of his words settle over the crowd, and for the first time she felt like something was actually happening. The people around her weren't just listening, they were starting to believe. They were starting to see that they didn't have to live in fear anymore. Max stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "It won't be easy. The council will fight back. But if we don't do something now, we'll never have the chance again. We have to stand together or we'll fall apart." The crowd murmured, a mix of uncertainty and agreement. Leela could see the doubt in some faces, but there was also a spark, just a flicker of something that could grow into a flame. They weren't just talking about rebellion anymore. They were talking about change, about freedom. As the sun climbed higher, the group began to disperse, but Leela could feel the weight of what they had done pressing down on her. They had spoken the truth, and they had made their stand. It wasn't over. It had just begun. But she knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back. She walked away from the mill with the others, the air feeling different now, charged with possibility. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of her mind, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Tomorrow, or maybe the day after, they would take the next step. And this time they would do it together.